It was a cold and silent night in New Mexico. The stars seemed to watch over the fate of a boy who, unknowingly, would become one of the most enigmatic and feared figures of the Wild West. Before being called Billy the Kid, he was simply Henry McCarty, a frail boy with restless eyes, born into poverty and the harsh trails of a transforming American territory. But what few know is that the ghosts of Billy's childhood were what truly shaped the outlaw the world would come to know. They say his mother, Catherine, was a courageous woman, a young widow who crossed the country in search of a better life. She worked as a laundress and did everything she could to keep her son away from the dangers of the streets. But fate, as relentless as the desert, seemed to follow Henry's every step. When Catherine died of tuberculosis, the boy was left alone, lost in Silver City at just over 12 years old. It was the beginning of a path with no return. There are records that even before picking up a gun, Billy had a sharp mind and an unusual charisma. He was polite, could read and write, a rarity for boys his age on the frontier. Some locals described him as a smiling, helpful child, while others claimed his eyes hid a dangerous restlessness. It is precisely in this contrast between innocence and wild instinct that the legend is born. Accounts from old acquaintances mention that Billy was raised by unlikely figures: an Irish blacksmith who taught him to be quick with his hands, a retired old gunslinger who saw a spark of courage in the boy and initiated him into the use of the revolver. And some say that long before the first shot, Henry already understood the law of the West, where the fastest survives and the slowest disappears in the dust of the roads. As America expanded westward, the orphaned boy wandered from town to town, between saloons, mines, and odd jobs, observing the darkest side of men. Every injustice, every betrayal, every humiliation planted a seed, and when the boy one day picked up a weapon for the first time, it wasn't for fame, it was for survival. It was the birth of Billy the Kid, and his true story was just beginning. The wind blew strong over the arid plains of New Mexico when Henry McCarty began to understand that the West did not forgive the weak. Still a boy, he wandered among ranches and small villages, seeking shelter, food, and sometimes just a gaze that didn't treat him like a delinquent. After his mother's death, the world had become a silent battlefield. Every suspicious look, every word of disdain shaped in him a contained rage, not the rage of a murderer, but of a survivor. At that time, Silver City was boiling with the growth of mines and the arrival of outsiders in search of gold and opportunity. It was the portrait of the new American frontier: packed saloons, aimless gunmen, and sheriffs with authority only on paper. Henry started with small jobs, cleaning stables, carrying goods, helping in kitchens. But misery chased him, and soon the boy found himself involved in petty thefts, nothing more than what many street kids did to survive. The problem was that, unlike the others, Henry stood out. His young face and innocent appearance drew curiosity, and also suspicion. One day, he was caught stealing a package of butter. The local sheriff, Harvey Whitehill, could have sent him straight to jail, but instead, he let him go, thinking the boy would learn his lesson. He didn't. Shortly after, Henry was accused of stealing clothes from a laundry. Arrested again, he managed to escape through the cell's chimney, a feat that many, years later, would say was the first sign of the legendary Kid, fast, bold, and impossible to contain. The escape marked the beginning of the outlaw's journey. Henry set out toward Arizona, crossing deserts and trails populated by bounty hunters, bandits, and dishonest soldiers. It was a lawless land, where government was slow to reach and justice was dealt by the speed of a trigger. In this setting, the boy began to change. He started to mingle with cowboys, miners, and fugitives, learning not just to survive, but to understand the silent code that ruled the West: loyalty, courage, and above all, reputation. It was during this period that Henry met the first man who saw him as more than a lost boy, a gunslinger known as John Mackey, a Civil War veteran. Mackey saw in Henry a reflection of himself, someone without a home, without a future, but with a gaze that defied destiny. Under his guidance, the young man learned to handle weapons with precision, to ride and shoot in motion, and to time a shot before the opponent even reached for the holster. They say it was Mackey who taught him to smile before shooting, a gesture that would later become part of his legend. But the learning wasn't just about weapons. Henry learned to read men, knowing when to back off, when to bluff, when silence was worth more than a bullet. He watched veteran cowboys tell stories of duels and betrayals, and in each tale, he saw the raw truth of the West. No one came out clean. Every town he passed through left a scar, and the boy began to collect his own. In Camp Grant, Arizona, Henry got into a fight with a local blacksmith. Accounts differ, but the outcome was the same. The man ended up dead. It was the first homicide attributed to him. Some say it was self-defense, others claim the boy was provoked until he lost control. Either way, in that moment, Henry McCarty died symbolically, and Billy the Kid came into existence. The name was simple, almost childish, but it hid the fury and intelligence of someone who had already learned everything about surviving in a world that spat out the weak. After the incident, he fled again, this time to New Mexico. There, he found refuge in Lincoln County, a region caught in a silent war between major cattle ranchers and local merchants, a conflict that would soon erupt into the infamous Lincoln County War. Billy arrived as a simple cowboy, but fate would push him into the center of the storm. Before that, however, he spent months working on farms, making friends, and beginning to form what would become his small circle of loyal companions. Many of these men called him Kid because of his youthful appearance, but over time the nickname came to signify respect and fear. It was a time when the Wild West was divided into two worlds, that of the lawmen, who tried to impose order on untamed territories, and that of the outlaws, who lived on the fringes, following their own codes. Billy, never having chosen a side, was pushed into the latter. The system treated him like a criminal long before he truly became one. So, he embraced the role. Between 1876 and 1878, the transformation was complete. Billy began to be known for his speed with a revolver, his skill on horseback, and his almost supernatural talent for escaping ambushes. But contrary to what later legends would claim, he was not a cold-blooded killer. Many accounts from those who knew him say that Billy was kind to children, polite to women, and even courteous to his enemies. A man torn between the kindness inherited from his mother and the brutality the West demanded. As tensions in Lincoln County escalated, Billy sided with a group of men fighting against the powerful faction of Lawrence Murphy, a merchant who ruled the county with an iron fist. On the other side was John Tunstall, an idealistic English rancher who saw in Billy not a criminal, but a young man capable of something greater. Tunstall took him in like a son, gave him work, and treated him with dignity. For the first time since his mother's death, Billy felt like he belonged somewhere. But peace would be short-lived. In February 1878, Tunstall was murdered in an ambush organized by Murphy's men. The death of his employer changed everything. Billy swore revenge. The orphaned boy, the farmhand, the kid who had escaped through a chimney, became a vigilante. He gathered loyal men, formed the group known as the Regulators, and declared war on Tunstall's killers. It was the beginning of the Lincoln County War, and of the myth. For months, the hills of New Mexico echoed with gunfire and screams. Farms were burned, ambushes became routine, and Billy emerged as a central figure in the conflict. To some, he was a hero seeking justice against corruption. To others, merely a bloodthirsty gunslinger. But the truth was more complex. Billy fought for loyalty, for honor, and perhaps for one last shred of humanity still left in him. In one showdown after another, Billy displayed an almost instinctive talent for warfare. He planned attacks, anticipated ambushes, and vanished before lawmen could catch him. His fame grew with every exaggerated tale in taverns and newspapers, and the name Billy the Kid became synonymous with danger. Yet behind the myth, there was still a young man barely over 18, fighting not for glory, but for survival in a world that had condemned him from birth. During this time, stories emerged of his laughter before shooting, of how he greeted opponents even amid crossfire, and how after every fight, he helped the wounded, friend or foe. The line between outlaw and righteous man became increasingly blurred. Billy became a reflection of the West itself, beautiful, dangerous, and unpredictable. The authorities, pressured by large landowners and merchants, began to treat him as a public enemy. Rewards were offered, bounty hunters began to circulate, and little by little, the boy found himself surrounded. Still, he kept defying fate, as if he knew his destiny wasn't to live long, but to be remembered forever. On cold nights, they say Billy would sit by the fire, cleaning his revolver and staring at the horizon. He spoke little, but his companions said he sometimes mentioned his mother, recalling how she used to call him, "my little Henry." That boy still existed, hidden behind the eyes of the gunslinger the world called a killer. And while the stars watched, the orphan boy, now a man, kept riding between legend and truth, unaware that the name Billy the Kid would become eternal in the pages of Old West history. The flames of the Lincoln County War were still burning when Billy the Kid began to realize that the conflict had gone beyond the limits of justice. What began as revenge for the death of John Tunstall had turned into a spiral of violence, betrayal, and politics. The law now had owners, and none of them fought for the weak. Eastern newspapers called the conflict a bandit rebellion, and the names of those involved, especially Billy's, began to cross borders, traveling by railroads and reaching big cities, where the figure of the Kid was already becoming a mix of hero and monster. While the powerful traded accusations and sheriffs chose sides, Billy remained loyal to the few friends he had left. Among them were Tom O'Folliard, Charlie Boder, and the Coe brothers, men who, like him, had lost everything in the war and now lived in the shadows of the law. They formed a small but fearless group, surviving ambushes and chases. In every town they passed, they left behind stories, some true, others invented, that fueled the legendary aura around the name Billy the Kid. During the summer of 1878, the war's final battle took place in the town of Lincoln. For 5 days, the streets were a stage of relentless gunfire. Billy and his men were cornered in the home of Alexander McSween, one of Tunstall's allies. The enemies, armed and in far greater numbers, surrounded the place and set it on fire. Smoke filled the sky. The heat and soot made it impossible to breathe. Even so, Billy remained calm. He waited until the last moment, when the flames threatened to consume everything, and then did something few believed possible. He escaped. Under a hail of bullets, the Kid crossed the fire, shot down 2 men, and disappeared through the alleys of the town. Witnesses said he looked like a ghost, moving too fast to be hit. It was the kind of story that fueled his legend. The boy who defied death, always smiling, always escaping. As the war came to an end, victory went to the powerful. Billy, now officially an outlaw, saw his world crumble. The regulators scattered, many were killed, and the bounty on his head increased with every new crime attributed to him. Still, he didn't leave New Mexico. He seemed tied to that arid land, as if destiny had nailed him there forever. Amid the manhunt, Billy still found time for small gestures that contradicted his reputation. He visited farms, helped acquaintances, smiled at children who saw him as a kind of romantic hero. In one of those places, he met Paulita Maxwell, sister of Pete Maxwell, an influential rancher in Fort Sumner. Paulita was a young woman with a strong temper, and some say that something more than friendship blossomed between them. To Billy, she was a glimpse of peace, a distant echo of the tenderness he had known in childhood. But life in the Old West didn't allow for moments of rest. Every month, new hunters emerged, and one name in particular began to haunt his trail: Pat Garrett. Garrett was a tall, reserved, and intelligent man. He had known Billy since the days in Fort Sumner, when the two played cards and shared stories in smoky saloons. When he accepted the role of sheriff of Lincoln County, he promised to capture the Kid, not out of hatred, but out of duty. It was the inevitable meeting between 2 men shaped by the same land, but separated by the choice of opposing paths. In the winter of 1880, Garrett began his hunt. Billy knew the noose was tightening, but he didn't seem to care. He still rode free, appearing and disappearing like a shadow. In December, he was captured after an ambush in Stinking Springs. Taken to Mesilla, he was tried and sentenced to hang for the murder of Sheriff William Brady, a crime committed years before during the war. The execution was scheduled for May 13, 1881. While awaiting execution, imprisoned in the small jail of Lincoln, Billy maintained the same calm gaze that had followed him since boyhood. He chatted with the guards, made jokes, even played music on an old banjo. Townspeople came to see him as if visiting an attraction. The killer boy, the idol of a West, still struggling to define itself, but no one imagined what would come next. On April 28, 1881, Billy carried out what would become his most legendary escape. Somehow he managed to free himself from his shackles, disarm one of the guards, and kill him with his own weapon. Then he climbed to a second-floor window, took the rifle from the second guard, and shot him with precision. He mounted the sheriff's horse and rode down the main street, shouting to the onlookers, Adios, muchachos! No one dared stop him. The news spread like wildfire. The newspapers turned him into a living myth. Some called him a demon, others a symbol of freedom. He was the boy who defied the impossible. The gunslinger even the noose couldn't hold. For weeks he vanished across the plains, hiding on farms and in villages. But no matter how far he ran, he seemed unable to leave behind the weight of his own name. Meanwhile, Pat Garrett continued his pursuit, driven by a mix of duty and melancholy. He knew the boy who had once been Henry McCarty. He understood that behind the gunslinger was a young man who perhaps only wanted to survive in a world that never gave him a choice. Even so, Garrett followed the clues that led him to Fort Sumner, the same place where Billy had found refuge so many times before. On that hot July night in 1881, the air was heavy and the silence sharp. Billy had ridden to Pete Maxwell's house to get meat for dinner. He entered through the darkness, unarmed, calling out to his friend, "¿Quién es?" "Pete, ¿dónde estás?" In the room, hidden in the shadows, was Pat Garrett. The sheriff heard the voice, raised his revolver, and fired twice. The accounts vary. Some say Billy died instantly. Others claim he tried to say something. But what is certain is that night, the orphan boy, the fugitive, the avenger, fell to the floor of a simple room, lit only by a flickering oil lamp. He was 19, maybe 21. The residents of Fort Sumner buried him the next day, near his friends Charlie Bowder and Tom O'Folliard. The headstone bore a simple name, Billy the Kid. No exact birth date, no mention of family. Just the nickname the world would never forget. But death, like everything in the Old West, is never the definitive end of a story. Not long after, rumors began to spread that Garrett had killed the wrong man. Some swore they had seen Billy alive in Texas, others in Mexico, even in California. Decades later, an old man named Brushy Bill Roberts came forward claiming to be the real Billy the Kid, showing scars and stories that seemed to confirm his identity. The truth was never proven, and perhaps that's exactly what keeps the myth alive. Billy the Kid became a legend not just because of his crimes, but because he embodied the wild and contradictory spirit of the West, the fight for freedom in a world ruled by injustice. Among the shadows and deserts, his name echoed like that of a ghost unwilling to fade away. And even in death, the boy kept riding, invisible, through the pages of history and in the songs of cowboys, who still spoke of a boy with a calm gaze and a fast gun, shaped by love, loss, and the cruel frontier that created him. As the desert wind continues to blow over the ruins of Lincoln and Fort Sumner, some say that on silent nights, one can hear in the distance the sound of a lone horse. Some claim it is the echo of Billy the Kid, still riding under the New Mexico sky, smiling as he did when the world was just a game between life and death. Time passed, but the name Billy the Kid never faded into the sands of New Mexico. Decades after that night in Fort Sumner, the sound of the revolver that silenced the young man still echoed in the conversations of old cowboys and in the dusty saloons of small towns. It was as if the boy's ghost had refused to die, remaining trapped between myth and history. With each generation, new versions of his life emerged, some told by men who swore they knew him, others invented by writers who turned his name into legend. And amid it all, one question persisted: who really was Billy the Kid? The years following his supposed death saw the birth of a cult around his figure. The sensationalist newspapers of the East, which had once called him a murderer, now portrayed him as a romantic symbol of the Old West, a rebellious boy who fought against injustice and challenged corrupt authority. For a country in transformation, leaving behind the wild territories and embracing modernity, Billy represented lost freedom, the last glimmer of a time when a man could make his own law. Stories multiplied. Some said the body buried in Fort Sumner wasn't his, that Garrett had killed another man in the dark. Others claimed the sheriff had let him escape, tired of the chase and moved by an old friendship. And there were those who swore that Billy crossed the border and lived for decades in Mexico, married, with children, changing his name and keeping silent about the past. Each version seemed more vivid than the last, feeding the myth of a man made immortal by doubt. In the early 20th century, the story gained a new chapter. In 1948, an elderly man named William Henry Roberts, known as Brushy Bill, appeared in Texas claiming to be the real Billy the Kid. He said he had survived the shootout in Fort Sumner, escaped with Garrett's help, and lived in anonymity for nearly 70 years. He showed scars, recalled names, places, and details that seemed impossible to fake. His face, though aged, held traces of the boy from the old photographs. Brushy Bill requested an official pardon from the governor of New Mexico, stating he wanted to die with a clean name. The meeting took place, and the story made headlines across the country. Journalists called him an imposter, but others believed him. Men who had known the real Billy claimed Brushy spoke with the same accent and remembered events that only someone in the kid's inner circle could know. Even so, the request was denied, and Brushy Bill died shortly after, in 1950, claiming until the end that he was telling the truth. The controversy reignited interest in the figure of the kid. Historians, investigators, and curious minds began revisiting archives, analyzing bullets, letters, and forgotten testimonies. In 2010, there was even an attempt to exhume the remains of Billy and Brushy Bill for DNA testing, an initiative ultimately blocked by legal and political disputes. The mystery remained intact, and perhaps that was for the best, because doubt had always been an essential part of the myth. While scholars debated dates and bones, the people of the West kept Billy alive in another way. In Fort Sumner, they erected a small statue over his grave. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, groups of enthusiasts, musicians, and onlookers gather there, telling stories and playing guitar under the desert sky. Some swear they feel a presence, as if the boy's spirit still wandered, curious, watching the world that moved on without him. In every small town in New Mexico, there's something that bears his name: saloons, motels, trails, museums. But the most curious thing is how time transformed the outlaw into a cultural icon. Hollywood embraced his story and reshaped it to suit the screen. From silent films to major productions, Billy has been portrayed by dozens of actors: Paul Newman, Emilio Estevez, Chris Christopherson, Val Kilmer. In each version, the boy changes a little. Sometimes he's the romantic hero fighting for justice. Other times, the tragic gunslinger overtaken by fate. None of them were the real one, but all carried pieces of the myth. The image of the boy with a wide-brimmed hat, mischievous smile, and pistols at his hips became a symbol of the American spirit itself, the eternal struggle between freedom and the law. Billy the Kid represented what the United States had lost in becoming civilized: wildness, courage, and a sense of absolute individuality. In a time of railroads and telegraphs, he was the last echo of the plains, the last to resist. But there is something deeper behind the fascination. Billy was not just an outlaw, he was also a product of abandonment, poverty, and institutional violence. He grew up without a father, lost his mother early, and never had a real chance. His transformation into a criminal was, in large part, the result of a system that pushed him out of society. And that's what makes his story universal. The boy who could have been anyone, but was shaped by a world that didn't forgive the innocent. In the following decades, writers and historians began to reinterpret the kid through a more human lens. They discovered letters written by him, revealing clarity and education. They found testimonies from women who described him as kind and respectful, a contrast to the killer portrayed by newspapers. Even some of his enemies in old age confessed that Billy was a good boy lost in a bad time. This duality, the killer and the boy, the myth and the man, is what keeps his image alive. Modern psychology might say that Billy the Kid was a product of trauma and survival. A smart, sensitive young man forced to learn that the West had no place for hesitation. His quick draw was more instinct than malice, and his fame came more from exaggerated stories than from reality. In total, there are only 4 or 5 confirmed deaths directly attributed to him, a much smaller number than most outlaws of his time. But the world didn't need statistics. It needed heroes and villains, and Billy fit both roles. The years turned the boy into a symbol of rebellion. Folk and country songs told his story. Poets mentioned him as a metaphor for lost freedom. Bob Dylan in 1973 released the album Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, one of the most melancholic and human portrayals of the character. In it, Dylan wasn't singing about a bandit, but about a man chased by fate, someone who, deep down, only wanted to live in peace. Meanwhile, archaeologists and history hunters continue to search for traces of the real Billy. In the desert near White Oaks, some still look for the hideout where he supposedly spent his last weeks of freedom. In Lincoln, the old courthouse where he was tried still stands, preserved as a silent shrine to his saga. And in Silver City, The place where his mother was buried receives visitors who leave flowers, as if paying tribute to the beginning of it all. To the woman who gave birth to a boy, the world turned into a myth. It's curious to think that, in his entire life, Billy lived less than 22 years. And yet, he left a mark on American history in a way few ever have. His image has appeared in paintings, comics, commemorative coins, and even video games. The boy who escaped through a jail chimney became a global symbol, representing the eternal tension between power and individual freedom. Even now, more than 140 years later, there's something in his gaze, in those few surviving photographs, that seems to transcend time. A look that is both defiant and melancholic, as if the boy knew he would be remembered not for what he did, but for what he represented. The look of someone who understands that history, sooner or later, becomes legend. On the quiet nights of New Mexico, when the wind blows across the plains and lifts the dust from old trails, locals swear they hear distant sounds, a horse galloping, youthful laughter, the snap of a shot lost in time. They say it's the kid, still roaming his territory, guarding his secrets, smiling at the mystery he unintentionally built. Because in a way, Billy the Kid never ceased to exist. He simply kept riding into what we call myth. As the decades passed, the name Billy the Kid became more than a memory of the Old West. It turned into a living metaphor, the symbol of an America divided between order and rebellion, between progress and freedom. Scholars kept trying to find the truth behind the legend, but the boy always seemed to slip away, as he had so many times in life. Perhaps because his story could not be contained in records or documents. Perhaps because what the world truly sought was not the man, but the myth he had become. Travelers crossing New Mexico in the early 20th century reported strange tales. They said that on full moon nights, they could see the silhouette of a young rider crossing the horizon, with his hat tilted over his eyes and the shine of a revolver at his waist. Some swore it was just a mirage caused by the desert heat. Others believed that Billy's spirit still traveled the same paths that had seen him grow and fight. In Fort Sumner, the oldest residents claimed that the kid's grave, even covered by time, never failed to receive fresh flowers left by unknown hands. But the fascination with Billy the Kid wasn't just spiritual. He had become a mirror in which America saw itself. By the end of the 19th century, the country had lost the Wild West to the advance of railroads, factories, and cities. The plains once ruled by cowboys and Indians were now crisscrossed by telegraph wires and iron rails. Wild freedom had been replaced by rules and borders. Billy, in this context, came to represent the last gasp of that vanishing world, a young man who refused to be tamed, even if it doomed him. Writers of the time, like Emerson Hough and Walter Noble Burns, helped cement his legend in books and serialized stories. Burns, in particular, wrote The Saga of Billy the Kid in 1926, a work that defined the romantic image of the outlaw as a tragic hero. From then on, the boy became a fixture in the American imagination. Decades later, cinema turned him into a global icon. Films like The Left-Handed Gun, starring Paul Newman, and Young Guns, with Emilio Estevez, reinterpreted his story, adapting it for each new generation, trying to understand what it meant to be free. But while the screens made him pop, historical reality became increasingly fragmented. Every detail of his life became contested: where he was born, how many he killed, how he really died. Historians revisited archives, examined bullets and documents, trying to reconstruct the path of young Henry McCarty. And the more they discovered, the more complex the figure of the kid became. He wasn't the monster some preached, nor the saint others exalted. He was, above all, human. A boy who grew up in chaos, trying to survive in a world that taught him to shoot first and ask questions later. In Silver City, even today, descendants of the first settlers tell stories about the boy who stole food to survive. They say he once helped a widow fix her roof and refused to accept payment. In Lincoln, some records show that Billy stood up for small farmers against the abuses of the powerful, even knowing it put him at risk. It was a constant trait of his personality, a kind of personal moral code, born not from written law but from the justice he believed existed among simple men. And there's something deeply American in that trait, the idea that the individual, alone, can challenge established power. Perhaps that's why his legend has endured for so long. The public wasn't just interested in the fast gunman, but in the symbol of resistance, the orphan boy who dared to confront corruption and authority, paying the ultimate price for it. Pat Garrett, the man who killed him, or claimed to have killed him, also became a prisoner of that story. After the shootout at Fort Sumner, Garrett spent the rest of his life trying to justify what he had done. He wrote a book, gave interviews, but never escaped the doubts and the boy's shadow. He died violently, murdered in 1908, under circumstances still poorly explained. For many, it was fate settling the score, the final act of a tragedy born in the desert. While time erased the physical traces, American culture kept reviving the myth. In literature, music, and fireside tales, Billy the Kid was reimagined in 1,000 ways, sometimes as an avenging angel, sometimes as a devil in a hat. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between the two extremes. In a way, the boy who never had a home ended up finding shelter in the country's collective memory. As history moved forward, Billy's figure began to be studied under new lights. Anthropologists and sociologists saw him as a reflection of the conflict between civilization and barbarism, between youth and authority. Psychologists analyzed him as the archetype of the rebel, the same archetype later used to describe figures like James Dean or musicians like Johnny Cash. All, in some way, were heirs to the Kid's restless soul, misfit youths defying rules and paying dearly for it. Even in the 21st century, the Kid's story continues to inspire. TV series, novels, and documentaries seek to reinterpret his life through more human perspectives, exploring not only the violence but also the loneliness and melancholy that followed him. In some portrayals, the focus is on his lost youth, an orphan boy searching for a place in the world but finding only the trigger as an answer. In others, the emphasis is on his loyalty, his sense of humor, and his charisma, which even won over his enemies. The inhabitants of New Mexico still treat him as a living part of their identity. Fort Sumner, Silver City, and Lincoln have become pilgrimage destinations for those who wish to understand where the legend was born. The old houses, saloons, and dirt roads remain almost untouched, as if time itself respects that piece of history. At night, when the sun disappears behind the mountains and the wind blows through broken windows, it's easy to imagine the distant sound of hooves and the echo of a youthful laugh, as if the Kid still rides among the ghosts of the past. In some records, there are hints that Billy may have left behind undiscovered letters, small notes hastily written, perhaps addressed to Paulita Maxwell or old friends. If they exist, they were never found. But the idea that he tried to leave his last words adds a poetic dimension to his figure. After all, even the fastest gunslinger in the West carried within him the human desire to be understood, to have his story told the right way. When looking at the myth of Billy the Kid, what remains is not only the blood spilled, but the humanity that endured amid brutality. A boy who never had the chance to grow up became an eternal symbol of freedom and contradiction. And perhaps that is exactly what makes him unforgettable. He doesn't represent only the past of the Old West, but something that still pulses in the human imagination, the eternal struggle between what is right and what is necessary to survive. And so, even more than a century later, the name Billy the Kid continues to cross generations. Historians still debate, musicians still sing, filmmakers still recreate him. But in the end, what echoes is the same image that haunted the plains of New Mexico: a young rider, light smile, steady gaze, riding beneath the desert sky. A boy who refused to be forgotten, and who, in a way, never was.